How do 17 artists from and working in Latin America draw from the rich artistic and intellectual traditions of their own countries while also interrogating their country's own fraught political and racial histories? Showing a breadth of medium, message, and theme, each artist in terms of belonging challenges traditional constructs of what contemporary Latin American art looks like and what it means to be working in Latin American artists today. Terms of Belonging addresses long neglected questions in contemporary art discourse. My name is Suni Mullen, an intern at GAVLAK, currently in my final year at Otis College of Art and Design. On behalf of GAVLAK, I would like to welcome you to this afternoon's virtual program. With us, we have Jose Alvarez, Gisela Colon, Ignacio Gatica Rojas, Gabriela Salazar, and conversation with Susanna Timken, curator of El Museo del Barrio. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Suni. I guess that's my cue. Thank you all so much. I'm really thrilled to be here with you all today together. Some of you I know, some of you I only know your artwork, so I'm happy that we can be in dialogue today. And some of you I'm meeting for the first time. Also want to thank, of course, everyone at GAVLAK, Sarah GAVLAK, Isabel for putting together today's PowerPoint, and especially Efrain Lopez, who not only invited me, but of course conceptualized the exhibition that brings us together today. As Suni mentioned, this is an intergenerational group exhibition that I really see the title that Efrain came up with, Terms of Belonging, as he expands in his text, as forming a reaction or a form of counterbalance to the more prescriptive identity-based approach to contemporary art, especially Latin American, Latino, Latina, Latinx art. In the text, Efrain cautions us against the overwrought insistence of belonging by introducing the word terms, and of course, thereby also invoking its opposite or causing us to think about the opposite terms of exclusion. So I've been really thinking about this title and all of its linguistic play, but I have also been thinking a lot, not only about the relationship between the word terms and belonging, but about the word terms itself. Because if we start to think about terms, it's a word that has many different meanings. So terms can be descriptors. So the terms Latinx, for example, who, I think maybe we'll talk about our own thoughts related to those sort of categorizations. Terms are also temporal. We can think about a term of office, a term of employment. And terms also relate to the conditions, going back to ideas of terms of exclusion, but also terms of agreement. And I think there, is usually a relational aspect involved when we think about terms in this way. So I think that some of these way of thinking about the terms is really going to offer us some insight into some of the artworks that we're seeing today. So before I think we start to have more of a conversational dialogue today, and again, I hope for the artists that are here with us, please, I know I'm leading the conversation, but I would love for you all to interject and ask questions of one another as well. But first, I'd like to really perhaps root us in why we're here today, really think about the context behind this conversation by asking each of you to maybe give us a little bit of a descriptor of your piece in the show, and then we can talk about some of these nuances that I sort of outlaid in this introduction. So I know we have the PowerPoint up. Perhaps we can just go in the order of appearance. I think, Jose, you appear first, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. So, the piece that I presented for the show is a mini introduction to a larger body of work. It's a meta performance that I did all over the world, where I presented myself as a type of a quasi-spiritualist, psychic channeler type of individual. And this was covered by the press over many years. And this piece in particular is an iteration from the one that I did at the Whitney Biennial in 2002, where I presented 5 monitors with the shuffling of the press that was given to me during that time, in a way kind of reflecting on the way that this repetition and this emphasis on a particular issue keeps being brought onto the social body. And the rooting of it was in this kind of persona that I presented myself to be.
And Jose, can you talk a little bit about that persona itself? I think that one of the elements of the exhibition is talking about the body and its presence or lack thereof in this work. And I think your piece especially does incorporate not only the body, but yourself, although, you know, channeling a persona or maybe not channeling a persona. Yes,
I utilize myself as the vehicle for the ideas. And one big piece of it was using crystal as a kind of the element that carry within it the possibilities of this performance, because I was trying to bring out this idea of unquestioned belief and how it's promoted and fostered in a sense, and how our desire for belief give ourselves into all kinds of exploitation. And that is one of the things that I wanted to carry with it. It was intense. It was an intense project in terms of the energy necessary to put up these big events. But eventually that performance was closed in 2000. As a matter of fact, the image that I have behind me is the last performance that I did. And in this particular photograph, I did it more as a private performance, a closing of that cycle of performances. And but this particular one that I'm showing in the gallery is the initiation of it in terms of the art world, and that was the one that I did at the Whitney.
Thank you. And one thing that I hope that we come back to when we bring the group together is I really would like to talk about your title, the idea of perpetuity as well in relation to our conversation today. But perhaps so that we can get to that point where we're all in dialogue, we should move on to our next slide and introduce our next artist participant today, Gisela.
Can you mute?
Gisela, do you wanna
oh yeah, I didn't realize that. My piece is this is a very personal and kind of autobiographical piece for me. It's the first one that I've made of this kind, and it required a lot of soul searching. You know, it's basically an incarnation of like layers of life lived, or in Spanish, I would say vivencias, because there's certain words in Spanish that you can only say in Spanish that carry such meaning. And this is really about vivencias, you know, and each layer has a meaning. And, you know, just bear with me because I want to just talk about each layer. Yes. The bottom layer that you see there is pulverized bullets. And this is a layer about violence. As a child in Puerto Rico, I experienced a lot of gun violence, physical violence, and also natural violence. I mean, physical violence, most of the men in my family would carry guns, and there were a lot of things that happened, deaths, aggression, very kind of emotional things that I buried for a long time. And, I'm basically coming out with this piece and talking about them for the first time. And that bottom layer also relates to kind of violence in nature, in the environment. I mean, we've talked a lot about Maria, the Hurricane Maria recently, and, Fiona, but I experienced, the OG hurricanes through my life there. So like, my great grandfather died as a result of Huracán San Felipe in 1929, where he lived in Arecibo and he was filling sacks of sand on the coast of the ocean. And he worked for 3 days straight to try and prevent the ocean from coming into Arecibo. And he died of pneumonia, leaving my grandfather, who was 12 years old, an orphan. So at 12 years old, my grandfather went and started working at a hardware store, and he would earn 1.5 cents a week with which he would buy bread and habichuelas para la familia, and he would support, his siblings that way. And then I experienced personally in 1979, Huracán David, which was one of the biggest of the time when I was in 7th grade. And I lived in Bayamón, in El Campo, kind of in a rural area where, we had no water, no electricity, there was flooding everywhere. There was a lot of kind of environmental suffering and violence and physical violence. So that bottom layer, that's what it really means. And stacked upon stacked are these life experience that I'm kind of bringing to the fore here. The second layer that you see there is the red earth from Puerto Rico, fango borinqueño, which has so much meaning because it provides life. The redness of the earth comes from the level of minerals found in the earth that generates that incredible flora and fauna that we see in Puerto Rico, El Yunque rainforest, the grasses everywhere, the trees, it's just a richness of life. And as a child, when things were going, there was very chaotic childhood. I lost my mother when I was 12, and I would always escape to nature. I would run outside in the matojos, which matojos are, these really tall grasses that just would grow on our farm in La Finca. And I would go and hide in the matojos, or I would climb on a tree and I would peel the bark of this eucalyptus tree that we had in Bayamón, where we lived. So I always resorted to nature as kind of a source of strength. So that's kind of the referential point of that second layer. And then the third layer is Western sands of California. So when I first, it really is, the Western sands represent to me the story of immigration and immigrants from all over the world who come here to California to kind of reinvent themselves. And, I've never told the story before, but I was born in Canada, kind of an accidental birth, because my father was studying in Canada, and then he took me to Puerto Rico as a baby, where I grew up my whole life and went to University of Puerto Rico, Recinto Rio Piedras. I moved to Los Angeles and went to graduate school. And when I went to apply for a student loan, lo and behold, they said, "You're an illegal alien," because my father had never taken care of dealing with legal aspects. So I was an illegal alien and I couldn't get student loans. And I remember going through this traumatic experience of like, oh my God, I'm going to get deported. This was in my 20s. And I experienced that rejection, which dovetails with the title terms of belonging, where, who am I? Where am I from? Where am I going to get deported to? Back to Puerto Rico? Well, that's ironic, because Puerto Rico is a US colony. So how could I get deported there? Where am I from? So there was a lot of kind of examining of identity at that point. And so that third layer, that's kind of what it talks about. And then the top layer is cosmic dust, which is kind of a metaphorical component in a lot of my work. And to come full circle, the cosmic dust, I can say a lot about this, but the one point that's very important about it is that it dovetails with my childhood, which is magical realism. Because I grew up with all this amazing magical realism around me, the literature, Gabriel García Márquez, Cien Años de Soledad, La Carreta by René Marquez, stories, mythical stories of, Anacaona and, Taínos and this, power coming from like the mythical aspects of our history, And then also my grandmother, who was a devout Catholic, and we would go to church on Sundays, La Parroquia San Jose in Guaynabo, and we would pray with the rosary beads. And then we'd come home, and over the cafecito, she would pull out the tarot cards and start reading the future. You know, she kind of did white magic, and I'd find all kind of weird things under her bed, like, you know, like bowls with weird substances and waters. And she'd always have like this clairvoyant aspect about her. And sometimes as a child at night, I'd be in, you know, she'd be rocking in the chair at night and kind of like on a trip or gone. And I'd come to her and I say, Ñaña, ¿por qué estás así? ¿Por qué estás llorando? Something, she'd be crying. And she said one time, porque veo la muerte de Kiko, which was her son, who basically, she saw him dying young. And in fact, it came to pass where she was able to foresee the death of her son. So I realized, oh my God, there's this world of invisible kind of like energy and mystical qualities and things that we don't understand. So that layer kind of embodies that aspect of the mystical, the unseen, the magical realism that I grew up with, you know, kind of like Macondo, because Puerto Rico was kind of like Macondo for me. And then the top monolith represents kind of the visible aspect, who I am seen as personally. Kind of what people don't know about me is what's below, you know, so like the underneath layers or what's hidden that I've never revealed that speak to my personal history. But also I think that in a way that totemic structure is really a collective representation of my vivencias in Puerto Rico in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So they tell the story through my eyes of what I experienced collectively, you know, on the island. So that's how I would summarize it.
Gisela, I mean, thank you for that wonderful summary. You know, one thing that I hope that we can talk about again as a group, but I think your work perhaps is like a great metaphor for our whole conversation is precisely, I feel like in a way, until perhaps this piece, but even with this piece, how are some of these elements of your identity kind of occluded within the visual language that you use? I think they are present, but may or may not be as immediately apparent as other readings, other more strictly identity-based readings. And I also, you know, just already want to point out, I hope we can talk about those allusions to literature coming from Latin America. I know that relates back to Jose's piece, and also, you know, your reference to sandbags, which we'll see again with Gabriela. So perhaps we should just, in the name of time, keep moving through to the next person. Ignacio.
Hola. Hi. Well, thank you for having me. I guess we'll be talking about the piece that it's in the show, right?
Yes, please, just an introduction to ground us in today's conversation.
Okay. Yes. So, well, I'm a Chilean artist. I'm based in New York now. And I guess that somehow what shaped the history of Chile, my country, informed the practice that I do now. For example, in this piece I did for the group show, I think now I kind of like was highly inspired by what was somehow a type of like cybernetic project that was never achieved in the late 60s in Chile, in Salvador Allende government. That kind of like I see right now somehow like as a ruin, because all of this like, you know, like technological advances couldn't see a light. So then I kind of like think somehow, because of right now like being based in New York, that what are those technological advances that were imported instead. And that's what I work with those somehow ideological technologies, to put it in a kind of a term. And some of them are the credit card that I used often. And I work with it, with its inner functionality too. And, I try to subvert it somehow, that functionality. And then in this case for the group show, the ticker display, that it's was created too in New York City. Funnily as the credit card too, and the ticker display was invented in Wall Street, of course, and still you can see it outside of the New York Stock Exchange. So those things kind of together and communicating in a more poetic interaction. Within that game, I try to create a new context for it, that then it can, open for more meanings, or kind of make it, filled with more meanings. This approach that these technologies usually have, that are, somehow like measurement units too, that really sometimes for the speed of things are somehow meaningless. I think I'm getting a little bit abstract right now, but
Yeah, well, maybe I'll ask you one quick question related to the piece, is the activation point of it, how the credit cards activate the ticker stock display that we see.
Yeah, so that interaction is actually somehow like that's an interaction. Actually, that interaction is an interaction. And each credit card has a magnetic strip that, in this case, it's programmed with an encrypted text that a swiper can read it, then interrupts the flow of this ticker display with a poetic message that I took from streets of, in this case, Chile. I took photographs of many phrases and graffitis that I liked in the context of the protest of 2019. And each credit card also has printed a facade of boarded up banks that I also took those photographs while I was here at that time. Sorry, in Chile at that time. And then, the interruption comes by somehow it's programmed to be connected wirelessly to the ticker display. Yeah. So the spectator can decipher these different messages.
So yeah, I love the idea. I loved some of the words that you were using to describe this, like to be able to encrypt and then almost expose the code that's underneath the stock signs, and the intervention between this global capitalistic economy and the language of the streets that you kind of insert into the ticker. Maybe Gabriela, if you would like to share your piece, and then we can all come together and talk about these ideas of ruins.
Absolutely. GAVLAK, Efrain, thank you, Susanna, for being here and inviting us. So the work that I have in the show, Primary Residence, Low Relief for High Water, is a kind of remaking of a part of a piece that was performative work done through the Climate Museum in Washington Square Park in October of last year. And it was a piece that was cast entirely in water-soluble paper from the windows of my childhood home. I use the built environment a lot in my work. My parents are both architects. They're both from Puerto Rico, and they came here in the late 70s. And I lived in the apartment that we moved into in 1982, all the way through till I don't know how old I was. I came back a few times after college and grad school. And then I actually moved back into the apartment shortly after my daughter was born, about 4 years ago. So it's a place that's always been a home to me, and a kind of, the kind of metaphorical center or safe space that is not available to everybody. But I feel like it should be. And so this piece was an attempt to kind of take that place that for me was so important and bring it out and make it vulnerable. And all of this being a kind of parallel to a desire to bring community together, to think about how we can make movement on climate action. And so the piece was in Washington Square Park. It was 12 of these panels. So you're seeing just one of what was 12, 8 panels. so a little while ago. And over the course of the day, I tore it apart and I gave it to the viewers. And so, it was this sharing of responsibility, trying to, in some way, make viewers feel either whether they take the piece, whether they care for it, whether they throw it away, whether they decide to just dissolve it, later in their bathtub, or in any one of these interactions, there's a claiming of a kind of interaction and a kind of responsibility, and I think for me also, it felt very vulnerable to bring my own home out, literally just to have it on the street. And it rained the day of the performance, which was really intense because the piece was falling apart as we were trying to do this distribution of work and take it apart. And so, it turned out that the entire staff of the Climate Museum was actually holding the work up as I distributed it, and it became this really beautiful symbolic sort of gesture of the need for a kind of collective action. And I think that's basically the piece. In my work, material is super important. So finding this paper that had this inherent vulnerability has parallels to other materials that I use in my work. Like Gisela, I think material carries stories, and it carries histories, and it carries much larger implications and associations beyond ourselves. And so, yeah, I find that really fascinating, and try to take advantage of it in my practice.
Thank you. I mean, that's a great summary. And again, now I hope that we can all, maybe I can ask a question, and please feel free to jump in, whoever wants to start answering. But, I think maybe going back to the title and jumping off of what you were saying, Gabriela, you're really bringing in this notion of home to a different place, to a public place, talking about these particularities of your own history, similar to Gisela. But it was interesting to note, how each of you described your positionality. Ignacio, you mentioned how, you're Chilean, but you're living in New York. And, when we were preparing for this talk, I shared with you all, an idea about diaspora and thinking about these terms of belonging, so to speak. So I'm wondering, how consciously perhaps you are addressing some of those issues in your work. Is this particularly, Gisela, I know this is the first time in a way that you have sort of exposed yourself in this manner, but do any of you want to, talk about the diaspora and how it impacts your practice?
I can add a little bit to what I was saying.
Please.
Yeah, so interesting. There was this quote going around social media the other day, and I don't remember the exact words. I'm just going to paraphrase, but it was something to the effect that, parents that arrived here from Latin countries basically were in survival mode, and they just had to put food on the table, and they basically were just struggling, and everything was a struggle. So they didn't have time to think of anything in terms of like purpose in life, or like, you know, like higher intellectual orders, and how the children, or maybe second or third generation, have the luxury of basically sitting back and pondering their existence and all that. Well, I was the parent in that story of the diaspora. You know, I came here with nothing, and you know, just have had a lifetime of struggling. I'm in my 50s now, you know, and that quote resonated with me so much, because I thought, you know, we've all been through, as a collectively, you know, there's a lot of separation and balkanization, or in the Latin community over this Latinx term, or whatever definitions, terms, like you say, Susana, because terms can also be divisive if you start putting different definitions or separations. But my personal experience with that vision of the different generations is that we're all in this together, and in a sense that just our experiences might be different, but in the end of the day, we're all Latin. And so that sense of community, I feel like we should always look for what we have in common rather than what separates us, you know, because each experience is informative to the other groups, you know. So if I'm a parent in that situation because I came here first, and then there's another generation that experienced it differently, I think we can just learn from each other's experiences, you know, as a community.
I mean, at the same time, I think all of your works, as we just saw, and as I, you know, was hoping that the exercise of really digging into your individual pieces really points to obviously your own particular viewpoints and artistic practices. But it also, I think, reflects a larger, perhaps a turn that we're just beginning to see, and that I think this exhibition is pointing to. I think the exhibition at the MCA Chicago that Carla Acevedo Yates is starting to point to, where we do want to look for solidarities, but really nuance the practices by a real engaged and engaging you know, investigation of material and of form, and of questioning the meanings of some of those pieces. Even when, I mean, one thing that I also find very striking, especially in bringing the four of you together, is, you know, these ideas of, as Efrain points out in his text, conceptual gestures and minimalist gestures. And, you know, even Gabriela, I think your piece perhaps conveys the most, you know, handmade quality, but it's actually quite a mimetic gesture in its construction, and in the fact that, you know, whether you have 8 or 12 pieces, you know, there's a repetition of the elements that go back to these ideas that we have inherited from minimalism.
Absolutely. And it's interesting that piece that you mentioned, the mimetic, because I have another work that's currently in No Existe un Mundo Post-Huracán, which is at the Whitney. And this question of the diaspora is something that I feel like in the piece that I made for that show comes more into play in the way that the material, you know, like this piece, low relief, that there's multiples and there's a recombination available, that, you know, the piece feels like it might not be fixed in the state that it's in, and that availability, I think, of a change, of a move, of a kind of shifting of parts is really important to me. And in the piece at the Whitney, which is called Reclamation and Place Puerto Rico, I wanted there to feel like that sense of reclaiming is directly tied with a sense of rebuilding and a coming together. And as somebody who grew up in New York City, you know, for me, the material that felt most at hand to me was the material that I knew from my surroundings in the city. And so I made the piece while, you know, in relation to the aftermath of Hurricane Maria and all that Puerto Rico needs, you know, in terms of self-sustainability and autonomy right now, using material that was mine. And so I think that for the diaspora, and that show in particular, I think really brings it together. It's that solidarity is important also, to like not create divisions between our experiences. In Puerto Rico, there's more, you know, there's more Puerto Ricans outside the island than there are on it, and that diaspora is powerful, you know. And so, you know, I think that being part of the diaspora can feel alienating sometimes, you know. I think there are ways that it can feel hard to understand what your place is, but it also, you know, I think can create some really interesting nuances of experience.
And Jose, I mean, maybe talking about like these nuances of experience, I'm curious to talk to you about the presentation of your piece in perpetuity, the repetition again that we see of the 5 monitors and the kind of you know, both disjointed and I think, you know, a completely engaging experience of hearing them all at the same time.
Yeah. The title came out of the contract that television producers ask you to sign whenever you are giving your likeness to a show. Where there is a line there that says, in perpetuity throughout the universe, your likeness, your whatever, it will be owned by us.
So terms
And
again.
yeah, and I just felt that whole phrase was just so bonkers. So I just love it because it echoes also the type of language that I was using in terms of eternity, in a sense of the search for the eternal. And so that is how that title came about. But there is this underlying atmosphere in Latin America of spirituality and anything that had to do with it, not to have much of a questioning of these kinds of things, but rather is assumed that we must. And this piece for me was in a certain way rebelling against that and questioning the proclivities that we have towards this kind of thinking, as if asking for more presence, of more desire to question these kinds of situations that I feel that at the end cost us a lot and are very, I think, detrimental in a sense to our well-being, even though it could come in sweet packages. Most of the time is all done about exploitation in one way or another. And I'm talking specifically about the individuals that come on stages and television and ask the people to follow them. And so this was a very large social experiment, and not only being a social experiment and a performance, but also a questioning of my own proclivities for belief. So it was a very intense performance in personal terms, but also in what created whenever it was presented. But I like that at that time anyway. I like that reaction in this piece that disturbed, to a sense, how things were supposed to be.
Well, it's interesting, if I can just ask you on that you said that you liked how you liked it at that time, because I was, you know, this is an intergenerational exhibition. A lot of the works come from different periods, but I think at least from the works that we're looking at, your piece is the most, I mean, I don't want to use historic, it's not, it's only, it's 12 years old. But I'm curious how you see this work today.
It feels odd. It's been quite a few years since I closed that performance, and as I said, this is images of the last performance, and I wanted to finish that cycle of performances with a site that represented more for human kind, like, science, technology, etc. So I wanted to use a site like that, and I used the Parkes radio telescope, which is the one behind me, instead of these pseudo new agey concepts that are supposed to give you some kind of information about the universe. But I felt that I said everything that I needed to say with that performance. There was nowhere else to go. And then I transitioned into object making, which also was a process all of its own, but very exciting process also to be able just to be in a space working on a very intimate way with a piece of paper in front of me, and just that, instead of television sets and theaters and all that implied, press, blah blah blah. That conceptual part of my journey was put aside into delving into something more personal, and that's how I transitioned into making objects afterwards.
Well, and I also just want to acknowledge that, like Gabriela, you are also in another exhibition right now, also at GAVLAK, Elegy for Venezuela. I think I have the title a little off, but
yeah, and that particular piece has to do with the tremendous crisis that Venezuela is suffering at the moment, and it's been suffering for quite a few years anyway. But it's 7 million people already exiled, and lots of them have lost their lives escaping the country. And it's a way for me to pay tribute to all those people that didn't need to lose their lives, and their families and their friends and their loved ones didn't need to miss them. And I didn't want to get into the whole political text, because we all know what that is. We have heard it everywhere. I wanted to concentrate on the pulse of life that these people brought into this world, and they keep doing it as we speak about them. And that's what the exhibition is about.
And I think in a way, it does relate to today's conversation. Again, we've been talking about, this shift perhaps that we're seeing right now in art history, but perhaps what's going to be a new swing away from some of the figurative. And I know that the pieces you have in this show, they do take a more abstract and I think a cosmic, and maybe they do have some kind of relationship with your past work, and not necessarily portraying the people that you're honoring, but rather creating a different kind of monument or homage.
Yeah, it's about, as Gisela was saying, about recognizing the humanity in all of us and how we connect to one another, and really seeing that brilliance. And if we take care of that brilliance, things can get easier. I truly believe that. And yes, of course, it's a connection with my previous work, because that is something that I'm very, very attracted to, and that I believe completely and wholeheartedly that we need to reach out for each other more and speak from there. Like the pieces that are in the space are called Songs of Freedom. And I feel that that's what we all have to do, just to start kind of expanding our awareness and consciousness about things. And then the songs will start, being louder.
Well, and maybe that's a great transition. I think I want to ask Ignacio a piece about being louder and sort of bombarding of information. I think that's sort of the disruption that you're creating in your work, kind of trumping I'm sorry, I shouldn't even use the word, but overcoming the straight so-called information of the ticker, of the economic ticker,
Yeah.
you know, words from graffiti.
I mean, yes, because I mean, somehow for me, the question it's, you know, all of this information data that we see, that it seems so important and that it fluctuates and that it's related to the speed of things that we live right now, like globally too right now, because all of these companies change and have affection of global economy too. And how that type of quantitative language is taken so seriously, and then versus the, you know, more poetic language that I think it's kind of like the excess needed to overcome this other excessive information. So it's kind of like I feel like that's the relation, or somehow, yeah, kind of like the dance there in the piece.
And can you tell us, I mean, again, I think especially in this shot, where to me, you know, I see Gisela's piece with its reference to, you know, light and space movement, Alfredo Jar's piece arranged in like the modernist grid. We see Lucia's work that's, you know, this perhaps a reference to Donald Judd, as well as the bodega. And in your work, I'm curious, you know, how did you come to the aesthetic solution of the credit cards all arranged in this row? Can you talk about like the conception of how you wanted to present this work?
Yeah, well, to be honest, a friend of mine, Jack Leibner, I really like her work, and I like how she kind of like, you know, the Brazilians have these things since Elio Itisica of breaking modernism, and then I feel like Jack breaks everything of minimalism in a very smart way. So I think it was kind of like the corporate look it needed, but at the same time referring to in a disruptive way of these minimalist approaches that I really like to play around with in a kind of like, you know, disruptive way as Jack masters it.
And I mean, that's also, I think, a really, I love all of the the words that you've been using every time you speak, the breaking, to talk about this project of yours. I know, I mean, time somehow always flies on these Zooms. It's both long and short. So I wanted to just extend to the viewers, if there are any questions, I guess we can put that in the chat. But I also wanted to ask the artists, if any of you, you know, since this is theoretically, you know, an exhibition around belonging and questioning belonging. If you have any questions for each other, I'm even curious to ask you all. You know, I don't know if you've exhibited together before. If you want to talk a little bit about the relations that you see or didn't see until you were able to see the show either in the gallery or like me, sadly, just virtually.
I love what Ignacio just said about breaking minimalism, because I do think modernism and minimalism in Latin America has such a long history of sort of being the language of a sort of utopic, different, you know, modern world, and has really, you know, both become symbolic of a lot of Latin American culture, but then also a symbol of the problems, right? And a kind of you know, parachuting in of aesthetics, and so this idea of sort of playing with it, breaking it, you know, I think is actually, I can see that in so much of the work in this show, of like stealing from that language to then undermine and to destabilize that expectation and that perfection, right? That Judd perfection, which I think is a really interesting connection.
Yeah, and I could add to that, Gabriela, that you know, my work, I've been informed by Judd also for years. So it was really great to see in the exhibition, you know, Lucia Hierro's reference to the stacks to my right, and then I have the stacked earth. So the stacked earth, all this, you know, matter from the earth that I've put on layers, not only references Judd, but Robert Smithson, because, you know, Smithson would bring the rocks and the earth from the non-sites like Franklin Quarry, which I visited, and, you know, he would bring that into the gallery and rearrange them in a metal crate on the floor. And so it was kind of like this way of reopening the dialogue about what it is that, you know, minimalism did, and adding a voice. All of us, I think, are adding a voice of a completely new perspective, where we're bringing in my case, just real life into the mix. So instead of a perfect, if you look at the pedestal on my piece, each layer of matter is in increments of 9 inches that has a mathematical meaning that can be broken down into multiples of 3, which is a prime number. And so conceptually, it's grounded in mathematical formulas, like the ellipse on the base of the monolith references pi, which is infinity, which is basically speaking about projecting into the future. And so that whole combination of the conceptual mathematic rigidity of the piece, but then bringing in the randomity and the organicism of how the earth is falling into these layers. And when I pour it, it becomes almost like a performance, like bringing in organic layers and, you know, then stacking one on top of the other. So it kind of has that polarity of the rational and the irrational, the visible, the invisible. So I feel like, in a way, it's really interesting to see the whole exhibition. I wonder if we can go back to the other slide. I don't know who's managing the slides, but where you can see, you know, Lucia Hierro's piece and my piece, and then, you know, Ignacio Gatica's, where they're all in a way referencing this dialogue of, you know, that history and breaking that history and adding to it and opening it up. And it's just really refreshing to me. And it was kind of a surprise to see all the work together. Kudos to Efren, because I mean, he just did a brilliant installation, the way they all talk to each other and have these nuanced reinterpretations of this conversation of conceptual, you know, mathematical, rational minimalism, and how we can all add from the voice of a Latin perspective to that history.
And it feels like that's like the unexpected, like we all add some element of a kind of, you know, if mathematical, if architectural, if financial, all kind of ask for a rational because they want stability and they want something that's predictable, then, you know, put in something that's not going to just follow the narrative, right?
Well, I think that goes back to minimalism basically was the object is autonomous. It has nothing to do with the personal history of the artist, and conceptualism, just like, you know, you know, like como se dice, the land art of the, you know, como se dice, the lightning field. I'm blanking on his name, but anyway, so that was basically nothing personal. And I think we're all adding in the personal, which is something that's just new and different in our generation.
I mean, I think to tie it back to the title, which is how I started, right? That's how these works both belong and, well, I don't want to say they are excluded from, but perhaps they're creating their own pathways into these traditions and breaking open new, you know, new possibilities for how you all are continuing to work. We are, let's see, 2 minutes from the official ending, I guess, if we wanted to keep this to our hour. I don't know if any of you have any just last thoughts that you want to share, or you know, Efrain's with us too, if you want to say anything as the curator of the show. One of these awkward Zoom pauses. Oh, there you are.
Great, thank you for everyone for participating in this exhibition, and Susanna for moderating today's talk. It's been very insightful to hear all of you in discussion with one another. I mean, I think that at the end of the day, that was really kind of the grounding force for this exhibition for me. I don't really have anything more to add other than I've just thoroughly enjoyed hearing everyone speak and be in dialogue with one another.
Thank you, Efren. I feel very honored to have been included in this and sharing it with all of you. And thank you, Susanna. Thank you all. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, likewise.
Thank you, everyone.
It was a pleasure.
Yes,
Yes.
hopefully in person one day. with all of you.
Totally.
Look forward to it.
Joining GAVLAK's programming today.